Hi, and welcome to an exciting episode of Mehfil, where, as the old tradition goes, we gather across borders and, in this case, time zones. My name is Amrita Ghosh. I am an academic, and I like to think and write about South Asian literature and film. Today's episode is called South Asia in Translation, and I have two renowned award winning writers from India and Bangladesh whose work in literary translations has brought a wealth of Bengali literature in translation into English, a legacy that may have otherwise not been available to international readers. I have with me Shabnam Nadiya and Arunava Sinha with me in the studio. Arunava Sinha is based in India and has translated classics and modern Bengali works, have traveled the world into Europe, the US, and Asia. Shabnam Nadiya is from Bangladesh and currently based in the US. Her translations and fiction have captured a vivid and literary Bangladesh for us. Welcome to the studio, Arunava and Shabnam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to begin with a curious question to both of you. Why translation? What began your journey as a translator? And do you recall your first book or fiction that you translated? What was that like?
Dia, you want to go first?
Sure. I think the shortest answer to that is that my journey began as a reader. And like many readers of my generation from Bangladesh and maybe even across South Asia, I grew up with a wealth of translated literature, beautifully produced books, lyrically translated children's books, mostly from the former Soviet Union. And that kind of shaped my childhood in multiple ways. It was soft diplomacy, of course, but it made my childhood a really beautiful place to be. And I still count a few of those books as favorites. So one I can't not name is The Casket of Malachite Rajhapi, written by Pavel Bazov. And it was translated by Rekha Chattopadhyay. And I still reread it every couple of years. I go back to it. My first act of translation, however, was when I was a teenager. I was about 14, and I'd read a science fiction story by Robert Sheckley Jr. called I think I can't remember the title now. I'm sorry, but anyway, I really loved it, and I wanted my friend to read it. And she lacked confidence in her English, and she was like, I'm not going to read the story. And to me, it just seemed like a common sense thing I'll just turn it into Bangla, I have both languages. And I didn't think of it as translation at that time. Translation was something official that, grown-ups did, and there were books and things. I just, I turned it into Bangla. But that was the first time I think I ventured to flex my language muscles, so to speak. My first official translations happened when I had just graduated. Two of my professors were editing a bilingual collection of creative work from Bangladeshi women writers. And they invited me to translate a handful of stories and poems. And it was through that project that I first realized just how much joy I found in this act of traveling across and between languages. And that project, I think I was in my early 20s. It kicked off a passion that remains unabated.
Aruna?
Yeah, I think if you actually change some of the details, Dia's story would be my story as well. So I used to read a lot, and some members of the family they would say in Bangla, "Ki eto porish?" What is all this stuff that you're reading all the time? And so I'd say, "Oh, don't you know? Here's what I'm reading," and I tell them the stories in Bangla. So I guess it was quite natural. And again, I had no idea that I was translating. It was not a formal process or literary process or anything. I think my first realization that translation was an actual distinct activity from writing a book in the language in which we believe it is written, but that's not always the case, as it turns out, was when Gabriel Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize. And in 1981, Picador in India released his first 6 books in this very beautiful white-spined editions. And I think it was the first release in India. And reading 100 Years of Solitude somehow brought home to me the fact that, hey, but Garcia Marquez wrote in Spanish. And So why am I reading him in English? And until then, of course, all of us had read books in translation without really stopping to make that come to that realization that the words we are reading are not the ones that were first written. Um, so I was in college then, and I thought, what does it mean to be a translator? Or rather, what does it mean to translate? Let's try to find out. So I actually formally sat down and just took some random texts that I really liked in Bangla and tried to translate them into English. But after I left college, we started a city magazine in Calcutta called Calcutta Skyline, and we used to publish, I think mainly it was my idea to sort of, hone my abilities and, or rather to test them. We used to publish a short story in translation in every issue. And I did the first few translations. So that was how I started doing it on a regular basis. This was when I was genuinely young. And then the first story we ran was one by Shankar. And a couple of years later, Shankar sent word to me asking if I would like to translate his novel Chaurangi. So I just sat down and hammered it out on the office computer after work every night, not having any idea. There was no real, I mean, English language publishing in India had started, but they weren't really publishing translations, or maybe they were, but not too many. And I had no idea that, it could actually one day be published. So this was 1992, and I gave him the translation, and I moved away from Kolkata soon after to Delhi with my job. And 14 years later, in 2006, Penguin actually decided to publish Chaurangi in English. And the editor in question called me and said, we spoke to the writer, and he said there's a translation already there. And he gave me the computer type script, and it has a name like yours on it. So are you the one who did it? So there was a lot of things fell into place. And yeah, that's how that was my first published translation.
So brilliant and lovely. I mean, you both have given us stories that go back a long time ago. And, for Nadia, you're mentioning it happened when you were a teenager at 14. And Arunava, you had a magazine, Calcutta Skyline. Sounds fantastic. Do you still have it, by the way? Is it still there? No.
You have copies of it?
I don't have copies here. A friend of mine who also worked for the magazine, he is the keeper. I'm the chucker. So he's kept all the copies.
But you both talked about the translation landscape, if you will, and I wanted to ask about that scenario itself. How has the translation scene changed for subcontinental South Asian writing specifically? Are we seeing a change in readership with translated literature, or is there the same kind of dominant Anglophone market?
Okay, if we were to talk about India, I don't think the Anglophone market in terms of books written in India by writers who live here is necessarily the dominant one anymore. I think that has changed, at least as far as fiction is concerned. That's probably changed in the past few years. And that, however, may have more to do with the fact that many more people are meeting their fiction needs now from OTT shows rather than from published books. So the serious reading, not a new breed of writing that came up about 10 or 12 years ago, which addressed a huge segment of emerging Indians who are very aspirational, very utility driven, and who yet like to read things that can tell them what they can do with their lives, whether it's in fiction or non-fiction. So a bunch of writers writing in English did have a huge market at that point, writers like Chetan Bhagat, for example. Right. But subsequently, that market has dwindled, because that need is now being serviced by your laptop or your mobile phone. And overall fiction market, therefore, has become smaller. And at the same time, there's been a rash of translated literatures into English from the non-English Indian languages, as a result of which the Anglophone, let's say the market is still Anglophone. The readers are still Anglophone readers. Right. But they're no longer reading books that were only written in English to begin with. And as a result, what's also happened is that there's much more diversity now and not just in terms of the source, but also in terms of the actual works themselves. There's much more diversity now in the books that people who are reading fiction in English in India are reading.
Fascinating. Shabnam?
I think the scenario in India is very different than the scenario. I'm based in the US, and I feel like this is a harder nut to crack coming from South Asia. One thing I do feel is like there is, I think, an interest. Translation is kind of having a moment, and there is interest from the readers, but I think that interest often doesn't get fed because book publishing, like any industry, it's complicated, and what gets published, where it gets published, who translates, who gets translated, like all those pieces depend on so many other factors. And there's a certain cautiousness among at least like Western publishers about what readers will expect and accept, which I think is a dampener on like what is allowed to get into the marketplace here. But there was a big win recently, Daisy Rockwell and Geetanjali Sri's Tomb of Sand. And I'm curious to see how that unfolds in different territories and what doors that opens up for the rest of our languages.
I agree. And Arunava's answer is promising in terms of the Indian publishing scenario. And I completely agree with you. Sitting and working in the US, it's a much different kind of space to crack in terms of South Asian literature or translated literature. But I do have to say quickly that, in terms of Europe and partially in Sweden, where I'm speaking from right now, my neighbor a couple of months ago, and the title slips my head, texted me, "Have you read this work?" And it was a translated literature from Bangla. So I was very, very excited that this is happening across borders in various spaces.
Hey, you told me about that book, Amrita. That was The Aunt Who Wouldn't Die.
Exactly. I did text you about that, this is happening here in my neighborhood. And this was fantastic. So it's promising all around. And I want to go back to Shabnam because I know that your new work is being reviewed everywhere. It's here. And you've translated some very important Bangladeshi works into English. The latest work that I'm talking about is Shaheen Akhtar's Shokhi Rongomela into English version that you've translated, Beloved Rongomela. What do you think of the specific Bangladeshi translation market? And, this is a follow-up because I also read somewhere, and I don't know where exactly, that you were inspired by some of the kind of imaginations of Sanjalila Bhansali's world as you translated. Is that really true?
I have to make a confession here. I have not really watched a lot of Indian film. I think my movie watching sphere was Bengali films from both sides of the border, and then English stuff, and a little bit of European maybe. I'm expanding my borders now, but yeah. So I don't know where that comes from. About the translation scenario in Bangladesh, it's like I've mentioned that like it's very different than in India, and English doesn't quite operate in the same way. And my impression about English in India is that it's truly kind of a bridge language, given the enormous linguistic diversity of the country. Bangladesh isn't quite a monolingual country, although many of us would like to think so, but we aren't. And it still doesn't have the same kind of variety. And that's a longer discussion and perhaps out of the scope of our conversation today. But speaking of the translation market itself, in Bangladesh, very naturally, we have a much larger readership for works translated into Bangla from other languages. Unfortunately, the publishing industry is still not very robust. And we hear that sales are high, so there's a market. but it lacks transparency. Data is hard to come by. Often, writers are exploited. So, but I don't really operate in that space a lot. So my sphere is more the Bangla to English scene, and I've not lived in Bangladesh for almost a decade now. And I do try to keep up, but it's not quite the same as being there. So I don't really have too much to say about that, to be honest.
Sure.
The market for English language books, whether written in English or translated into English in Bangladesh, does exist. It's small, however. But again, my experience has been that that segment of readers who read in English aren't as interested in translations from Bangladeshi or Bengali authors, which is one of the reasons I sought publication in other regions.
And what about, this particular, I think it was a review in Hindustan Times that came about very recently, as of probably last week or this week.
Yesterday or 2 days ago.
It was 2 days ago. So they were talking about this Bhansali imagination kind of world. What would you have to say about that in your recent translation?
I had to look up who this was. I had to Google the name to find out who this was because I had no idea.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I told you I'm very ignorant about Indian film.
Well, that's a kind of an interesting thing, that the comparison was that world that you created in your language. But
the other comparison was to George R.R. Martin. I don't know if I'm saying his name wrong.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it was, I read it last night. I read the review last night. And at the very end, the reviewer does two comparisons. And those are the two names. I was like, okay, I know one. I don't know the other.
The Games of
I know one name, but I have not watched Game of Thrones. So again, I was like, I'm ignorant about both of these things.
And it almost seemed like it was kind of your voice that was being mentioned, that, you had imagined these two worlds. So it's pretty interesting how these reviews kind of happen. But Arunava, I'm interested in something that has fascinated me for a long time. And I'm going to write about this too. And I've read so many of your translated works. This particular one sticks out for me because of this sort of extraordinary range, the subject, the use of language. And I'm talking about Rabisankar Bal's Dozakhnama, and originally written in Bangla. It is about these two iconic Urdu writers, Mirza Ghalib and Sadat Hasan Manto, and in translation, Conversations in Hell, ultimately translated into English by you. And the text has translations of Urdu couplets and poetry in each of these chapters as they begin. And at times, Bengali words are thrown into the text. How difficult was it for you to translate such a linguistically sort of patchy text?
Dozakhnama is a mood, and if you start thinking of it in terms of language, then you are not going to be able to swim in it. So you just go with whatever it throws at you, and it doesn't matter what language is being used or what anachronisms there are. I mean, for example, there's a part where Ghalib quotes Tagore. So it's beautiful, really, the way he does it. And you can't let these things stop you, right? As far as I was concerned, it was a Bangla text. I know that Rabisankar Bal was looking at source material in various languages, but I did not stop to think about that because I wanted to go with what the writer had done. I didn't want to insert myself into a process of, looking up the original couplets or trying to figure out what lay behind them or what the Urdu text said and so on. I had a writer's imagination transforming the material he had into a book, and that was the book I was translating. So I stayed with that, and I actually did not consult anything that Ghalib had written or in any other translation, because I felt even if Rabisankar Bal had done his own version of it, I would stick with that version because that is what he had done. I was not, it's not a biography. It's not meant to be a translation of Ghalib's works or Manto's works for that matter. So that was the thinking. And once that happened, it was not a problem anymore, It was a Bangla text.
That's fascinating. And you bring up a really important sort of subject in translation that we have around. There's a debate about fidelity and infidelity in translation. And this is for both of you, translators who are very loyal to the text and those who take some kind of creative leeway. There are two groups almost. Where do you both stand when it comes to this? And I even hear there's another sort of category called transcreation. So what do you think about the kind of debate?
I think a lot of times those debates are more academic than anything else. Arunava and I have had a working relationship and a friendship for many years now, and I think both of us, we're practicing translators. I can't speak to Arunava's experience, but I took one course maybe. And while my practices has not been informed by any academic theory, or I've learned as I've gone along. And it is like any creative work. It's an evolving process. And so I can look at, translations I've done almost 20 years ago, and I can look at what I'm doing now, and I can see the difference in how I approach anything. And for me, some texts allow more space than others and demand more space than others. Overall, I think what I try to do is I try to stick as close as I can to the text itself. But I don't think it's not fidelity to move away if that's what the text requires. My end goal is always to try and evoke the same emotional response that the original evoked in me. And I want the English language reader to feel what I felt when I first encountered the text. And I think that's all we can do. And this is also why translation is creative, because it's not just one language to another. It's a particular translator's reading and interpretation, and bringing all of that to the end product is what you're getting as a reader. So if you give both of us the same text, you will maybe come up with very different translations, because the way he uses language and the way I use language and the way we interpret different. Who I am as a translator will to some extent seep into my text, and I think that's how I think about it.
That's beautifully said, Arunava.
Yeah, what Diya said. I mean, I don't really have much to add to that. I just want to say that all these very cute arguments and discussion that take place about whether translation is creative writing or whether there's transcreation. I think all of this is very meaningless, because it is a process, and the reader doesn't care whether the translator is a creative writer or not, right? The reader is reading Shaheen Akhtar, and the reader does not want to read anyone else. Let's be very clear about that, right? The reader does not want an interpretative dance based on Shaheen Akhtar's text, right? So that's what they're reading. And as translators, it is our ethical responsibility as they are to give the reader as close an experience as possible to the one we ourselves got when reading that text. Now, we can get better and better as we go along as readers. We can stop being ourselves and we can try to be the universal reader or something like that, but we'll never actually get there, right? So eventually every book is reinvented when it's read. It's a combination, it's a collaboration between the writer and the reader. But what we can hope for is that we don't bring our predilections and biases and philosophies and ideas into the translation. We don't inject ourselves into it. And in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve, this is not about improving the text. It is about trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes using the exact same words in a different language will not achieve it. So that's when you do what you need to achieve that. But it is very much about fidelity. I mean, using a different set of words is not about moving away from the framework of fidelity at all. On the contrary, you are actually not taking the easy solution. You are actually saying that I'm going to try harder and do other things in order to arrive at the same effect. And sometimes these things are so practical things. For example, both Diya and I work from Bangla, and we have a word in Bangla which is bikel, right? Now, bikel is a particular part of the day in a tropical country.
Right.
So it's like 3:30, 4 o'clock till about 6 o'clock, and
Right.
it doesn't change very much depending on the season, because in a tropical geography, the sunset hours don't change too much.
Hmm.
The concept does not exist in the countries which are closer to the poles, let's say
Yes.
the UK and much of the US, because in summer you could have daylight up to 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and in winter the sun will go away at 3 o'clock or 3:30. So the word does not exist. Now, when you encounter it Bikel is also a mood. It's
Yeah.
like if you're a child, then it's when you go out to play. You're out of school and it's the time you're playing. If you're at home, it's when you maybe stop doing whatever you're doing, you have a shower and you go out and it's a little time for yourself, and to face the world when it is in a more pleasant form. It is not very hot, the sun's
Hmm.
going down, there's a breeze. So all of these things. Now, if you would say late afternoon, you can to convey
Hmm.
the information of Bikel, you're not going to be able to convey much of the emotional content of Bikel, right? So depending on the context, you may need to do something there, right? Does
Fascinating.
that mean I'm trying to improve on the text? No. The
Yeah.
original text uses a shorthand for a very big thing. The shorthand is
Yeah.
not available. So I have to unpack it, open it up, or contextually do something. Sometimes I may
Hmm.
not bother because it may not be
Hmm.
relevant. So stuff like this keeps happening all the time, right?
Hmm.
But that is very much a product of the desire to ensure fidelity.
Hmm.
Not
I love the way that you both are really unpacking how it is close to the text. And Shabnam, you said what the text requires, and Arunava, you just mentioned ethical responsibility, and it is about fidelity to the text. And I'm staying with this, with the idea of choice. The translators you both make, and still academically going back, there's so much of translation theory now, the original or the source text and the translated work, and it is understandable that not everything from the original can be translated into the new version. As you mentioned, the concept of bk as a mood, I love that. And there is also this kind of trope that circulates about untranslatability. So have you faced such a challenge? And you mentioned, Arunava, something like this, that, with the concept of BKIL, it's not late afternoon. It's, a lot of other larger things. So what are the choices then that you both make as translators to leave things in the original text? Or how does the process work for both of you?
Yeah, well, I don't know that there's any one rule for this. It will vary from text to text. And again, I don't believe anything is untranslatable. It's just that you have to find a way to translate it. And if translation is considered to be as narrow a thing as finding an equivalent word or phrase, then yeah, a lot of things will be untranslatable. But it's all the product of human beings, and there's no way that you cannot convey to another human being what one human being is trying to express and themselves through, and you can't say, no, I can't do it, it's not possible. So that's not the case at all. Also, this business, there's a lot of talk about leave things in the original, leave words, leave phrases. I think, again, none of this is bound by any rules. You may choose with one text to do it, you may choose with another text not to do it. It is true that very often you will catch multiple layers of references and meanings in a text, where you may choose to foreground something and push the others to the background, and your translation choice may reflect that. And again, two translators may choose to foreground two different aspects of a particular piece of text, right? Especially for poetry, this works. Someone may want to go with the rhythm, someone else may want to go with the sounds, right? So neither is wrong. It's just a matter of what they see, where they see the poem residing, and what best to take in there. But it as far as theory is concerned, I think theory is quite fascinating, because it allows you to, theory to me is something that you can always test with your praxis. So when somebody says this is what's happening in this translation, and you can throw it against the work you've actually done yourself, and sometimes you say, yeah, they're right, this is exactly what's happening. It's just that I didn't do it consciously or thinking about it that way, but you can find patterns, right? Even when the patterns are not consciously built into a process. At other times, it's bottom. And the fact is that theory doesn't claim to be right all the time either, right? Theory is just a model.
Yeah.
It's a model, and it's the map. It's not the territory. And the map may be accurate, but the models, those who are creating models, are trying to create models to get closer and closer to the territory. It doesn't
Sure.
mean that every effort, and that's the way science works as well, right?
I like
So
to say how you related to kind of a scientific pattern
yeah,
almost.
when we are building models that try to explain the working of any bit of physics or the universe, we're not saying this is the last word. What Newton built was not the last word, but what Einstein did with Newton's works was to give it more finesse and make it work. At a very broad level, Newton was right. Einstein took it a little further. So even if you narrowed it down, he would still be right. So you couldn't have had an Einstein's work without a Newton's work. So in the same way, your work keeps evolving and getting closer and closer to what's happening. But also, I like the fact that translation is a dance which will elude you eventually if you're trying to pin it down to rules and methods and processes, right? It's going to elude you. And much as I am a rationalist and I'm a complete disbeliever in anything mystical, but I have to say that there are some processes that are internalized, and this is true for any artist.
Yes.
There's some processes that are so internalized that you are not able to articulate them or express them. Doesn't mean they're not methods. It's just that you can go from step 1 to step 10 without consciously taking each individual step. It's just telescoped in your head and in your muscles. So then it sometimes looks like magic, but it's not.
I agree, it is magic. Magic.
I love that.
I like I mean, what you're saying, I agree with that. I think like theory doesn't drive anything. That's how I look at it. Like theory follows, and it's still the work that is primary, and that's what theory follows and tries to explain and tries to pin down, as Arunava said, and which is fine. But I feel it's more, to me at least, like as far as my translation goes, it's more an interesting intellectual exercise to read that and find out, oh, this is how they think about these things. Yeah. And sometimes, yes, absolutely, it brings a clarifying lens to what you're doing. Because I think like the process, as you said, Arunava, you don't necessarily, when you're doing something, you don't necessarily think through each step. It's there. And things happen. And a lot of it happens just inside your heart and your brain. So seeing that kind of articulated, which is not something I'm capable of doing, so seeing someone else articulate it is always like, oh, okay, that's very interesting to see. That's what's happening. So, yeah. But I was thinking of your word, use of the word bikel. So the similar, kind of the same time period during a day will, like, so I was thinking about how, like, within even the same language, there are cultural differences. So in Bangladesh, we use the word bigal, of course, but we also, a lot of kind of similar baggage exists for us with the Maghriber Waqt, which is the period of time when the Maghrib prayers are, and or somebody or like, you know, you'll come across and during Bikel, the Maghrib azan has sounded, which probably it doesn't have the same kind of implication or doesn't have the same kind of nuance to a West Bengali reader, but to the majority of us, that's when you go home if you're a child. Like that was your curfew. You heard that, you knew you had to be home in like before it's done. So, you know, even within the same language, you have these differences. And that's one of the things, especially in Rongomela, we were talking about that book earlier, because there are so many different cultures that within Bengal that exists in that book. That was something that that I had to like think about a lot. Yeah. One of if it's okay, I just want to give a specific example, for instance.
Yes, please.
So in Rongomela, there's like this one scene where so the young queen, I don't want to give away spoilers, so in case, you know, anyone actually goes and finds the book and reads it, but a royal maid brings in a mullah to into the zenana quarters, or the inner quarters of the royal household. And so to the majority of source language readers, they will immediately understand that this has like multiple layers of transgression. It's a Hindu household, it's a Hindu royal household, and it's the inner quarters. So it's a man who's coming into the women's quarters. It's a Muslim man coming into the inner quarters of a Hindu household. And then there's like, the class issue, because this is the king's household, and he's a lower class person. And so like, how do you, and all of that can be conveyed just by the fact of his name. If you're more or less from South Asia, you kind of read the names and you can tell, oh, this person is Hindu, this person is not. How do you convey that to a non-South Asian reader? And
Exactly.
and I hate footnotes, like not going to do that at all. So I try to provide clues, like I tweak the text tiny bits. So instead of like having the mullah brought in, he's smuggled in. Instead of having shutting the window so that like nobody can see inside, that there's like a man here, like the windows are quickly shuttered. So like really tiny additions like that, tweaks like that, and overall, and this is also like what you were talking about, Arunava, that we find different ways. There, like untranslatability is like, yes, it might not hit the 100% absolute mark at all times, but we always have to find a way, and for the most part, I think we do.
Yeah,
This is absolutely mesmerizing. I mean, in so many different ways, you're explaining what really goes on into creating good translated work. And I'm thinking of sort of changing the direction a little bit. We're talking about translations and theories of translation. And I want to shift a bit to the political grounds of it. So we're aware of the complicated and sticky histories between our countries, or between communities within our countries too. Do you ever find yourself challenged by a political position, translating something, let's say, that tests your political limits in whatever source language text there is?
it can happen. I mean, for example, I translated classic historical romance by Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay called Tungabhadra Tire, which interestingly, when people, it's been read by generations of Bengalis, and I don't know how many of them had actually cottoned on to the fact that it is extremely Islamophobic. Whenever it talks about Muslim rulers, the tone changes, and the overall depiction is very clearly a good guy, bad guy kind of thing. But when people read it as a romance, they're not registering it, if you know what I mean. But when you're translating, obviously you're reading it and then it jumps out at you. So in my case, I didn't do anything to the text. That's the way the text is. I added a translator's note at the end saying that the translator's position is not the same as the writer's. Wow. The writer may have taken a particular stance, but I'm distancing myself from the stance, but I'm not changing the text for that reason. The text is the way it is.
Yes.
So yeah, these things happen. And then you also realize, I think the past few years have also taught us, and Diya and Amrita, I will tell you this, that as someone belonging to the male gender, I've learned to read differently over the past few years. I've learned to read and watch out for things that I would not have batted an eyelid at 10 years or 15 years ago, to see the innate kind of misogyny or the innate kind of intolerance that very often surfaces in the writing of male writers when they're writing, and when they think they're writing very sensitively as well. So this is the kind of things, situations I've encountered as a reader, and then as a translator as a result of that. But I feel that it is important to call out these things. It is not my job to bowdlerize or to make it more palatable. If anything, I need to make it clear that this writer did this, and that this is the history of our literature. and let's not turn our eyes away from it. Let's read it, let's learn from it, and let's learn to do better. But that does not mean we change what's been done, because that would be you're erasing history. Then you're saying that it was never there. There was never a problem. That is crazy, right? To say there was never a problem. There was a problem. There is a problem. And I think translations can do a lot to bring that to the attention, not overtly or anything, but you can, because interestingly, some languages, you can spot some things better in some languages. So I think misogyny you spot better in English. Sometimes you don't spot it so well in your mother tongue, because you are so used to hearing your mother tongue all around you that you don't stop to think about different elements of it. Yeah. I mean, take the simple word, mechele, right? The word mechele to mean May has been used by Bengalis for eons. And I dare say many of them did it without any sort of without using it to look down on women or anything. But the point is, you can use the vocabulary of the oppressor without being the oppressor yourself, right? In any circumstance, and you must know that you're doing this, and you must stop. Now, what would you do? You can just translate it as girls and make it very benign, or you can find a way to make the reader question the word used. And just leave it there. And if the reader wonders, why is it this way? Why is this word being used? Then, at least it will trigger some line of thinking, and maybe someone will go further and take it from there. So I think these are the things, interesting opportunities that translation does throw, which I was not aware of earlier. I mean, I've only become aware of them of late, I have to say.
This is brilliant. Shabnam, I want to ask a question about publishing itself, but I want to first hear from Shabnam.
It was so fascinating for me to hear you speak of misogyny in Bangla literature, because I think as a woman reader and writer and translator, I was thinking of what I've translated and how I've translated over the years. And for the most part, I've chosen myself what I've translated. So I intentionally focused on translating more women writers than male writers. That was a choice I made many years ago. And I translate everyone. If I like like most translators, I have to like the text. That's the first thing. But I'm in the middle of rereading a couple of writers I used to read a lot when I was younger. And despite the fact that, I haven't read these writers, and I'm not going to name them, in several years, over 2 decades maybe. And even though I was aware, I feel like now when I'm rereading, I'm a much older person, I'm a much older reader. There are things that I didn't notice when I first read these that I'm now this is appalling, the level of objectification. And I don't think any of it's done with intent. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is, because that's just the way our culture is. And there are so many, one thing that comes up again and again in one writer's different books that I thought, so it's a very tiny detail, which is the man wakes up at 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. He's had a nightmare or a bad dream. And he'll ask his wife, can you get me a glass of water? And I think 20 years ago, I wouldn't have thought this. It was a natural thing. But now I think you're a grown-ass man. Go get yourself some water. Why are you waking someone else up? Why are you waking your wife up to ask at 5 a.m? Don't do that. But if I was to translate this, obviously I would keep that in. And I've not really been faced with that as much. So I've not been, but that's a really good solution, Arunava. Just add in the note, just calling it out so that readers who might otherwise miss it will see, oh, that is there.
But this is so brilliant because, I've been thinking about what Arunava and you both said about the language itself and seeped in misogyny or Islamophobia or other kinds of problematic positionalities. But what about the politics of publishing? If you both do a translator's note, has there ever been a space where the publisher may have a problem with such a note, or do publishing structures pose a challenge in any way in both India, Bangladesh? Shabnam, you talked about publication market in the US, but more specifically about these kind of politics of publishing per se?
I haven't really encountered that yet, where a publisher or a venue is saying, don't want to publish this. But I am embarking on I'm taking on a project next year that I'm curious to see when we start looking for a publisher for this. So let me tell you a little bit about this particular book. So in the 60s, there was this massive hydroelectric dam that was built in Bangladesh, which was then East Pakistan. And it basically powered the nation. Mm-hmm. But as we know, like in many of these instances, there was massive displacement that happened. And the people displaced just happened to be indigenous populations. This was probably in our part of the world, our part of the region, one of the biggest forced displacements that happened. And thousands of people left for India, and they're spread across. So this is kind of a part of our history that we do not talk about much. I did not know about this until I was like well into adulthood. And so there's a Chakma writer from the Chakma community, Shomari Chakma, is a friend of mine. She's a lawyer, and she had to go into exile. So she wrote a book which is essentially a collection of oral histories from the survivors of that displacement. And she interviewed people who are still in Bangladesh, as well as people in Northeast India. And it's a fascinating story. Like her own personal story is fascinating. She met relatives. She met, for instance, a sister of her father's who, after they migrated to India, they had no contact with. So it was like, it's just like, it's a very fascinating part of our history, a very harrowing, terrible part of our history. And there is not a lot of documentation. That generation is dying out. So this book is very, very important. And she could not get anyone to publish it in Bangladesh. Wow. Because people are scared. And so eventually she had to basically publish it herself. So the book exists, but it is not readily available. And so anyway, we talked about this, and I said, and a lot of the people do not know. A lot of the people this is like a cultural artifact for. A lot of Chakma people do not know Bengali, so they can't read the text. And she was like, there are a lot of young people, especially the families I met with in India, and they're very curious about the book, but they don't read Bangla. So I was like, okay, we just turn it into English. That's what we have to do. So I haven't started the project yet. The original text that she published, she had to revise because there was a lot more material which she couldn't include in the first edition. So now we have like a solid manuscript from her revised version, and I'm looking forward to starting this process. And I'm very curious to see how that will be received, what difficulties we face, because as you said, like this is something that might be a sticky point for many people. It's an uncomfortable part of our history, part that we don't want to look at, but it's there, it exists.
Sounds like a fantastic project. Arunava?
Yeah. No, again, we if anything, the publishing community is actually quite progressive. So far, and they don't put up roadblocks for anything. There are sometimes legal issues because their lawyer will say, no, you need more proof, you can't say this, which is fair because you can't really say things that are unsubstantiated in a book. You can say them, you can share them in private conversation, but the way things are changing in India, you never know where it goes. So far, I think one reason that books have not been interfered with largely, not entirely, but largely, is that no one reads them. I mean, the people who are concerned about these things don't read books. They're too complicated for them to read. They actually have to read the entire book to get something out of it. When they're low-hanging fruits, Like, somebody went and filed a case against Wendy Doniger's book on Hinduism, and then the publishers arrived at I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but they withdrew the book from the market. So these things have happened. It's not that they have not happened. And I can tell you, Amrita, if tomorrow Shukumar Rai's play and Leela Mojumdar's plays with the figures of Ram and Sita were to come out in languages outside of Bangla, I would really like to see what happens.
You should translate Lokhone Shakti Shell.
Yeah, Lokhone Shakti Shell is relatively benign, but there is this one fantastic line in Leela Mojumdar's play where Hanuman sees Sita for the first time. He's been sent off to rescue her, but he doesn't know what she looks like. And then he finally sees this this full-on figure walking up, and he's very worried that she's going to steal his biscuits because she looks really hungry. And what if she takes away his food? and he's got a guide with him to sort of help him identify who he has to rescue. And the guide says, "Oh, no, she won't take your food away because she's very upset. That's Shita or Shite," as he says. And then Lokhon's brilliant line where he says, "Ei Shite, erom sundari to Kishkinder pothe ghate pawa jaye." This is the famous Sita. We find more beautiful women on the streets of Kishkinda, and Kishkinda is the home of the monkeys. So that line is a very loaded line indeed. Now, I would just like to know what happens in the current scenario if this were to get out of Bangla. And the funny thing is that even the people who would object to it in Bangla have not read it, because this is not the kind of books or literature that they will read. But if they did, there would certainly be very interesting things happening. And because these people are part of Satyajit Ray's family, the ramifications are really going to be exciting.
Oh, hi. But I think you should be doing this, definitely. But as we try to wrap up this absolutely fantastic episode, I want to have two more lighter, fun questions for you both. You both mentioned there's joy in the translation, that you began your literary translating careers so long ago. But I can't imagine translation is only all fun and exciting. It can be messy and arduous, and you've talked about the meticulous ways that you translate. Tell us one of the biggest challenges that you both have had in your journey as a translator.
So I mentioned that publishing industry in Bangladesh is not super robust. And one of the big things that just doesn't really exist there is good editing. So it mostly depends on, but I also know as a writer that when you're in the middle of writing something, you oftentimes lose track of the details. So, there are certain things that happen, you start writing, you're reading this book and you'll suddenly realize that a character's name has changed.
Wow.
So stuff like that. But one of the funniest things for me was when I was translating Rongomela, there's this one scene where the Zamindar, who apparently was, he's not good for much else. He's a womanizer. But he was a crack shot. So there's an infestation in the crop fields. And so one of the things about Shokhi Rongomela is that Shaheen used a lot of local words, and it's set in southern Bengal, which is also a region where my father's family is from. And she uses a lot of those words. A lot of the dialogue is in that local dialect. And I can't speak it, but I've grown up hearing it, so I know the sound kind of. So anyway, there's this scene where there's this infestation of something called kalam in the crop fields, and the zamindar is called in by his uncle, and he's get rid of them. So he goes up with his gun. So I asked her, what does this word mean, kalam? I've not encountered this in this context before. And she said it's pongopal. So pongopal are locusts. And it's right. That makes sense. But then later on, there's a scene where he's shooting them. I'm like, how do you shoot locusts? This doesn't make sense. And then later on, there's another scene where one of the employees of the royal household are bringing back baskets full of black birds. So I emailed her again, like, okay, so this happens and then this happens. And so like, none of this is really tracking. And she's like, shoot, I used that word. So around the same time, I was on the phone with my dad. And so I was like, well, I can ask him. So I asked him. And he's like, no, that doesn't mean locust. That means it's a kind of black bird, which is like, they really like eating. So they go off the rice paddies. And I was like, oh. So I called her. And she's like, oh, your dad's actually right. I haven't lived in that region she grew up there, but she's like lived in Dhaka for a large part of her adult life, and she's like completely forgot. And I remember thinking I need to check this when I was writing it, but then I forgot and it got published. So I'll have to remember to like change that in future editions. I don't know if she actually did that. That was like really, really funny. But you have to do that sometimes, just like track down what exactly the writer meant. And which is, I could ask Shaheen, but you can't always do that. Right now, I'm working on a collaborative project with Mahmood Rahman, the translator and writer, who also happens to be my husband. And this is our first collaborative project. And we're working on this book called Jibon Amar Bon, My Sister Life by Mahmoud Haq. And he's a writer who's like every other sentence is just loaded with so many allusions, references, this and that. And tracking all of those down is, I think it's like, that's probably one of the most difficult things we'll have to do. And he passed away several years ago. So there's no way to call him up and just ask, what did you mean with this?
But congratulations on that new project.
Thank you.
Arunava?
Oh, well, I think the worst thing that can happen to a translator is when you're into a translation and then you suddenly discover that text is not so great after all.
Oh,
I mean, not that it's a bad book, it's still a very good book, but the writing is perhaps sloppy. And as Dia said, it could have done with some editing. And it's sloppy, and your translation just slows down. I really believe that good text translates itself. There's something very innate in the rhythm of language which you can take from one language to another, But when it's sloppily written, badly, awkwardly written, clunkily written, you really struggle. And then you curse yourself. and then you're caught in that point where you say, should I quietly just make it, smoother, more graceful? Or should I let the clunkiness remain, and so on? And then you're really annoyed at having to encounter these questions. They're not really a question you should have to answer when translating. Absolutely. So fortunately, it's not happened to me too many times, but I have to say it has. I'm not going to tell you which books, but it has happened.
I was going to ask you, but I wouldn't now.
Also, sometimes like something that reads really beautifully in Bangla, seems ornate and flowery in English. That's like also another thing. Like, this is really beautiful. Why is it not the same in English? But a lot of times it just isn't.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you.
Yeah,
true, Arunava. But on that note, I wanted to end with this. To me, it's a fun question, an interesting one. But what you said, Shabnam, is absolutely true. Certain words translated just don't make the same impact or the kind of poetic sense. And so this is where I'm kind of putting you both to work here. And it's almost like, it feels like an assignment. But when Radical Books Collective founder Bhakti Shringarpure came up with the title of our series episodes, Mehfil, we had a specific ethos in mind, and we thought of South Asian culture. The word Mehfil conjures these history of arts, music, creativity. And yet, when we were thinking of translating it, the word gathering, it just completely loses everything that Mehfil is supposed to mean. What would you suggest for Mehfil?
Look, this isn't even homework. This is like a pop quiz.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that you need a word for it specifically, because this is what you used to have in the 19th century, right? Those salons in your homes where rich people would run these salons. So I suppose you could use that word. But to
Hmm.
me, this question actually, and the point you made, Amrita, about some words not, all translations seem to pale. I
Yeah.
think this also has a lot to do with the translator's anxiety of being too close to the language from which they're translating.
Hmm.
Because we have lived our lives in Bangla, we are I think, overly worried about protecting everything in it.
Yeah.
Many people who translate, and this is particularly interesting when you're translating between two languages which are completely apart, far apart culturally and in terms of their roots and so on. So many people, for example, those who translate from Japanese into English, if you look at their last names, they're not Japanese. They're English-speaking people who have learned Japanese and who are less emotionally attached, I would argue, than we
Wow.
are. So
Hmm.
I think that it makes more sense for them. They're more concerned with getting it right in English. We are more concerned with getting it correctly out of Bangla, and that sometimes can create, I think, too much of friction. So I have learned to let go. I've learned to
Hmm.
let go and say that I will. I mean, this is how I think of it.
Hmm.
If I go to the Taj Mahal, it's going to evoke a lot of for me every time I go. If someone from the US comes to the Taj Mahal, they're not going to feel all the things I do, even if they're looking at the same object. Now, to me,
Sure.
that's what a translation is, right? They're looking at the same thing, but they're looking at it from where they are. They're looking at something new. So they're looking at a book from a culture that they've not lived in. So I can't
Yeah.
expect them to feel and know and have all these illusions in their heads. I should not. It's wrong to expect or to overload
Hmm.
them with information that will
Yeah.
ensure that they make the connection. And even so, they will not.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
So
right.
yeah, so I've learned to let go and say that, okay, at the end of the day, yeah, I can leave Mehfil as Mehfil and let the reader figure it out. If the word yields a lot of its meaning in context anyway, you know what is
Yes.
going on there, right? And you can arrive at a judicious guess. Or I can somewhere else insinuate the word salon to sort of nudge them towards what I'm getting at. But the fact
Yeah.
that I'm still using the word mehfil and not directly substituting it will tell them that it's like, but not quite.
True. Fair point. Absolutely. Shabnam, did you have anything, a final word to add?
I totally agree with you, Arnava. And I was thinking about the way you phrase it of letting go. And I think absolutely that has been part of my journey as well. It has been a process. And that's one of the things when I look back on my older translations that I think, as you phrased it, I moved more towards getting it right in English and not necessarily trying to bring everything it means to me from the Bengali. And I feel like that's okay. It is a different language, which means not just the words we speak, but it's completely a different culture, which means a completely different. Like it's okay. It's a different world,
Yeah.
and that's what we're trying to get across. And as you said, Mehfil is a gathering, sure, but it carries so much with it. And Ceylon isn't, and Ceylon is the first word that came to my mind as well. But that's like very not
Yeah.
very much like a Western concept. It's like not ours. But
Yes.
as you said,
Exactly.
alike, but not the same. And um, I think like it's okay that Mehfil cannot be conveyed with a single word. I'd
Mhm.
probably use a gloss if I was using it somewhere with
Mhm.
judicious interspersion of like descriptors here and there to just as you said, Ornava, to let the reader know that there's more here if you want to dig. And
Mm.
I feel like as a writer and a translator, I need to trust my reader to want more, to engage more, to explore more, and that's all I can ask for.
Absolutely.
Thank you, both of you. This has been an amazingly great episode on so many details and mesmerizing stories. I am absolutely excited about this episode. Thank you for this wonderful mehfil.
Thank you
Thank you
for all
for
the
having
great
me.
questions.